And that was Lucinda Williams singing Get Right with God. And good afternoon, welcome to The Wild Side. This is your host, Kight. And today I'm going to be talking about evolution. And I was inspired to do this because I have been working with a course up at the University of Exeter that has been talking about evolution. And so I thought I'd give you guys another kind of taster of some of the things that we talk about up on campus and some of the stuff that the students are learning. And in this case, it's a first-year course, and it's an introduction to kind of all the basic concepts of biology. So a little about genetics and evolution and animal behavior and conservation and how all of these things kind of fit together. So obviously, evolution is quite an important concept to understand because it does drive pretty much everything else that we study in the field of biology, and in particular in the field of behavioral ecology. Now, to understand a little bit about evolution and how it kind of fits into things, you have to understand also what happened before Darwin came along and proposed Darwinian evolution. And I say that because there are actually other types of evolution, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So before Darwin, pretty much everyone believed that what was written in the Bible was literally true. So God created all organisms during the 6 days of creation, and this is outlined in the book of Genesis. And people throughout the years kind of calculated this as in order to figure out when did this happen exactly, how old is the earth. And so they assumed, after doing some rudimentary calculations on who knows what data, that the earth was about 6,000 years old. And obviously that is quite a bit younger than we know that it is now. But 6,000 years was what they calculated, and they even came to a precise date and time. So these people, and they were mostly clergy who were responsible for these calculations, they decided that the earth was created on the 26th of October in 4004 BC at about 9 a.m. And since that time, species were all created then, and then they remained unchanged. And there was very little variation, they thought, also within a species. And as I'll talk a little bit about later, there is, of course, quite a lot of variation within species, and this is what allows evolution to take place. So, pretty much everything that they thought was incorrect about how organisms were created and how they might change over time. Now, when I say this, I'm of course not trying to make any sort of comment on religious views. I have no interest in trying to persuade you that God did or did not create organisms to begin with. Basically, I'm interested in everything that happened since then. So once the earth was created and there were organisms upon it, what happened? Were they different at that time than they are now? Have they always been the same? Did they or did they not have variation? That's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about today. And it probably isn't that important for me to make this distinction here in the UK, but of course I'm American, and back in the US this is a very contentious issue. And in fact, there are still a lot of creationists in the country who still believe that the Bible is literally true, and this belief is much less common here in the UK and actually in the rest of the world. And these are similar ideas as those that are reflected in the concept of intelligent design. And the thing that's amazing is that people were interpreting not just biological data, but also geological data and astronomical data incorrectly because of this belief. So for example, this is why people thought for a very long time that the Earth was the center of the solar system, or the galaxy, or even the universe. And this is from stuff in the Bible. It's in Psalms and Chronicles and Ecclesiastes. And so these beliefs go back a very long time. In fact, all the way back to Aristotle at least, who devised a hierarchy of beings that was arranged around the idea that there are people and there are other organisms, and then there are kind of gods and godlike organisms, and there's this hierarchy that arranges those things together. So Aristotle believed that at the bottom of this hierarchy were minerals, which were non-being, and then above them were men and animals and plants, and of course by men I mean humans, and these were all in a state of becoming. And then you had angels and demons above that, and these guys were in the state of being. And then above that, at the very top, you had God, which of course is all-encompassing and everything. And of course, if you look at these beliefs for too long and you start having some questions about the natural world, then you might notice that there are some questions that aren't too easy to answer using this logic. So for example, why do we have fossils? Why do they exist? Do they represent mistakes that were made over time? Do they represent something that went wrong and then died out? Are there multiple creation events? And if so, why does the Bible only talk about one? Is there some sort of trickery on behalf of God? Has he created these just to challenge us in some way? Does this suggest even that God might have some sort of fallibility where he has done something wrong or made a silly decision? Another question is biodiversity. So why do we have so many creatures, including lots of creatures that do the same job? So that seems kind of redundant and inefficient. Why would that arise? Also, why would we have unpleasant creatures? So things like parasites and bacteria and viruses, things that cause diseases. Why would any god decide to create something like that? And also, as I alluded to earlier, there is this issue of the age of the world. So as time went on and we had people specializing in geology and coming up with better techniques for measuring things and for taking samples from the wild, they began to realize that actually the age of the Earth is much older than that calculated 6,000 years. In fact, it's millions and billions of years old. So how can we reconcile those facts, that increasing amount of data, with what is said in the Bible? And in fact, there were several pre-Darwinian thinkers who had proposed different evolutionary theories to try to explain some of these patterns. This amount of time over which organisms were able to come into being and potentially change, and also the mechanism that might allow them to change if in fact they did. So people like the Comte de Buffon, Erasmus Darwin, Robert Chambers, and Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And of these, in this list, probably the one that you'll recognize the most, who is the most famous, is Lamarck. And he's responsible for suggesting that parents would acquire traits during their lifetimes and then pass these new forms on to their offspring. And actually, this is not Lamarck's original idea, but he did expand on this. So this goes back at least as far as Plato, but then Lamarck was able to really explain it quite well, and his theories were disseminated much more broadly. And the classic example of this, the thing that you'll probably remember if you've had much schooling in biology, is the idea that giraffes are the perfect way to talk about this and to think about this. So you would have some individuals that have maybe kind of short necks, and they're out in the wild and they have all these large trees around them. They're very tall and they can't reach them. And so over their lifetimes they would strive or they would wish, and this might not be a conscious thing, but they would need to access those tall trees, and they would have some amount of flexibility. And so over their time around these trees, they would eventually grow longer necks because of this need and desire. And then once they had those longer necks, they would pass that trait on to their young, and their young would have longer necks as well. And the mechanism for this was some kind of an internal force of, wishing or desiring, but it's not very clearly defined, it's kind of vague. And it also doesn't explain the mechanism by which the adult trait could be given to the young. So specifically, it explains the phenotype, the morphology, what we see when we look at an organism, but it doesn't explain the genotype. And of course, people back in that day didn't know about genes yet. But basically, no one had thought there might be some little particulate thing that could hold all of that information about how long or short a neck will be, and then pass that on to the next generation. And so this theory makes no allusion to that at all, and so it doesn't really explain how you might have this thing that can be inherited from one generation to one generation from the one before it. Lamarck also suggested that all taxa were created separately, and then they evolved from there. But there was no extinction, and there was no kind of branching tree-like pattern like the one that we're familiar with today. And just some food for thought, because here I have kind of slandered Lamarck a bit. There's lots of evidence suggesting that Lamarck was in fact wrong, but people now think that maybe this kind of process that he talked about does have a role in things like culture and imprinting and other aspects of behavior and kind of behavioral ecology. So even though he was wrong about how species might have come into being, he probably was right about the fact that there was some sort of a process like this in the natural world. And that was Muse with Survival. And I think that Charles Darwin would definitely appreciate being talked about shortly after a little bit of Muse. I'm sure that's exactly the sort of music that Darwin was a fan of. So now that I've lampooned Lamarck a little bit and all the other guys who came up with ideas of evolution, prior to Darwin. Now it's time to move on and talk about Darwin himself. And what I'm really talking about is Darwin's book On the Origin of Species, which came out in 1859. And you may know that there was a big celebration on the anniversary of this a few years ago in 2009. And I had the pleasure of going to go see David Quammen talk about Darwin because he wrote a book that was published exactly during that celebration. And it is a wonderful book that I really suggest you read because it's all about how Darwin really agonized over this theory that he had developed. Excuse me, and it's also about kind of the relationship between Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who also came up with a theory that in many ways was very similar to Darwin's, even though it's Darwin that we give credit to for this theory. And that's actually in many ways correct because Darwin had some details that Wallace missed out on. But anyway, this is a great book, and I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head, but I'll write about it on the Wildside website. And again, it's by David Quammen, and it is quite a lovely book. So, the theory that was developed by Darwin and Wallace really moved biology into the realm of science by explaining the existence of lots of different species through a process called natural selection. And it looked at natural means of change rather than supernatural means, and not just change but also existence to begin with. So all of this can really be traced back to reading Malthus, and Darwin read Malthus and he realized that organisms could produce more offspring than ultimately could survive in the environment because conditions are harsh, resources aren't always available, and even having little minor differences from one individual to the next could be enough to give an individual a leg up over another that is a competitor in that same environment. And if you had this leg up over someone else, you potentially would survive better, and you then could probably breed a bit more, and then you would also pass those favorable characteristics on to your offspring and allow them to potentially do the same thing. So over time, this would allow those traits that are, those beneficial traits that allow you to survive and reproduce more, to stick around and become more common in the population. So little by little, you'd have the whole population changing over time as well. So you've got changes in individuals and changes in the population, and that can lead, in fact, to changes across the whole species, no matter where it's living. And this is something that was quite an amazing thing because it could explain how species are not fixed in form, but in fact can change over time, or as we call it now, they can evolve over time. And that the environment, both the abiotic parts of it, so things like droughts and the temperature and how much rain there is, things like that, but also the biotic parts of it, so whether they're predators or diseases or resources that you might eat for food, all of these things together can contribute and change over time. So then you have changing conditions outside that mean that different characteristics of individuals will help them survive better or worse, so that will then change again. And so you've got this concurrent evolution, basically, of as the environment is changing, so will individuals change. And this is really an amazing thing that completely fundamentally changed how people viewed the world, because they no longer thought that organisms were in stasis all the time, but in fact could be fluctuating at every moment, basically. So the theory of Darwinian evolution really has three major parts. And the first is the idea that there is change from one generation to the next. The second is that you can have descent with modification. That's probably a phrase you've heard lots of. And the third is that you can have changes in gene frequencies. And you can also divide Darwin's theory into four postulates. And these are, first, that populations contain variation, so I mentioned that earlier. The second is that some of that variation is passed between parents and their offspring, and another way to say that is that this variation is heritable. The third thing is that individuals will vary in their ability to survive and then reproduce. And then last is the idea that survival and reproduction are not random events, but in fact they are occurring because of these traits that some individuals have and others don't. So the mechanism behind this whole process, I've already alluded to it, it's natural selection. And this is what Darwin described as the preservation of favorable variation. And part of Darwin's understanding of this process came from looking at domestic animals. And interestingly, this is something that Wallace didn't really, it wasn't that he didn't think about it, because he did, but he rejected that what happened in domestic animals might reflect the same sorts of processes that happen out in the wild. So Darwin looked at artificial selection. He was very familiar with, for example, pigeons, and also with livestock such as cattle, and the processes that, well, not the processes, because that was what he was kind of thinking about, but he saw the characteristics and how they changed and how dramatically you could alter a particular characteristic just within a few generations. But he also looked at these things happening out in wild animals. And of course the classic example of this is the finches that he saw while he was on the Galapagos Islands. But there were in fact lots of different things that he noticed that were similar species that he found in different places that had these little changes, or even within the same place he would find different versions of the same organism that all had tiny little variations. And it was whenever he was thinking about these things that he realized that actually this variation could be something that was a key to understanding why we have so many individuals and how we might have individual species, sorry, and how they might change over time. Now, people actually pretty quickly, when they heard about evolution, they thought, okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I understand that, and I'm happy to go with that. Even though it sounds like it would be really controversial, and as I said, Darwin did agonize over this because he was quite afraid of bringing this to the public and seeing what the public reaction would be. But actually, people weren't too ruffled by the thought of evolution, but what really got them was the idea of natural selection. And the reason for that was partly because at the time, the mechanisms of inheritance were unknown. And by this, of course, I mean genes. So even Darwin himself thought that inheritance worked via a process that was known as blending. So this is the idea that offspring would always be a blend of parental attributes. So that means that if you had, for instance, this is the example that was given in class, if you've got a parent that has a trait that's red and the other parent has a trait that's white, when those two breed, that trait would be pink. And then you would have lots of pink offspring breeding with other pink offspring, and they would just have pink offspring. And very quickly, you would never have any red anymore, and you wouldn't have any white anymore, you would just have pink. And so this doesn't really make any sense. Then there's no variation, and then you couldn't have evolution. And this is quite a conundrum, of course. But this is a conundrum that was solved by someone else that you'll probably have heard of, and that is Gregor Mendel, who came up with the idea of Mendelian genetics. Well, he didn't call them that, but that's what we call them now. And he actually did this shortly after Darwin. In 1865 and then again in 1866, he published some papers on his now very famous experiments on peas. And unfortunately, he was largely ignored until the early 1900s, at which point some other people kind of found his papers again and wrote about him a little bit, and then that kind of really spawned a whole lot more thinking on these topics, and things really took off from there. And what Mendel was able to contribute was the idea of particulate inheritance. So the idea that there are units of heredity, and he called them factors, and of course we now know them as genes, and these things were what he realized were responsible for traits. And what he realized was that they should be discrete and preserved during development so that they can be passed on in the same form to the next generation. Now, of course, we now know that there are processes called mutations, but still, for the most part, you can't expect that these things, even though they might have slight little mutations, will basically go on from one generation to the next. And he even knew that some of these would be dominant and some of these would be recessive. So this is what he was studying when he was looking at the peas. So he was looking at the peas that were smooth and the peas that were wrinkly, and he was able to find out that some of the kind of surface characteristics would be determined by a dominant trait and some would be determined by a recessive trait. So this means that sometimes you'll have offspring that will look like one or both of the parents, and other times they might look completely different. And this is how you can have a trait that's not very common, you don't see it in either parent, suddenly come up in the children or the children's children later on. So it's been hiding in wait all that time. And what we now know is that blending is the result of a more complex process. It's multi-gene interactions, and this is something that's quite valid for some traits, but not for other traits. It all depends on how these things are created. So things like height, for example, and eye color and hair color, some of these things are determined just by one trait, some of them are determined by one gene, some of them are determined by multiple genes. And so you really have to just get lucky and pick the right characteristic to study, and that was what happened for Mendel. Now I said earlier that genes are passed on in the same form from generation to generation, but of course that we also know there is mutation. And mutation is really important because it is the answer to another question that was faced by Darwin. And that's how you can explain the fact that there is variability that comes up. So where do all of these differences come from one individual to the next? And we now know that the ultimate source of that variation is mutation. And this is something that was actually thought of and realized as early as the beginning of the 20th century. So geneticists like T.H. Morgan, even way back in the day before they had the amazing sort of equipment that we have now, were able to realize that mutations occur in every single generation and they can occur for every single trait. They may not, but they can. And many of these mutations are going to be deleterious, so they're not going to be helpful, and they may in fact be quite harmful. But many of them can be neutral, and some of them, every now and then you might get lucky, are going to be beneficial. And of course all these things are context dependent. Something that is harmful in one setting might be really great in another setting, and that's kind of the amazing miracle of evolution. But the fact is that these mutations do occur, and they give selection this variation that it can then act upon. Now in case you're curious, in humans the mutation rate per genome, per generation, is something on the order of 2 to 20. And you might think, well actually, given how many genes we have, and given the fact that actually there's a ton of material that's not even a gene at all, it's just spacers in between genes, or it's pseudogenes, so things that were left over and are no longer really used for anything. 2 to 20 and all of that, over all of those nucleotides, is probably not that big of a deal. It's not going to make that much of a difference. And that is true, but if you think about how many people are in our population and how many individuals are born within each generation, then actually it can make a hugely significant contribution to the number of new traits that are out there per generation to make a difference on our population. And I should mention that all of these rates, they vary depending on what type of species you are, what your sex is, what gene we're talking about. So some things are under very strong selection and some aren't, and that's going to wipe out these mutations very quickly. And you might have equipment that is very good at detecting mistakes in the genome as it's replicating, and so fixing them right away. So it's going to depend on lots of characteristics within the organism. So other species might have much higher rates of mutation and others might have much lower. And that was Shawn Colvin with Change is on the Way. Now, I was just talking a little bit about Darwin and how Darwin came up with his ideas of evolution and natural selection. But of course the story did not stop with Darwin. Lots of people have taken his ideas and run with them and made huge advances in our understanding of the natural world and how things work. And that's actually the next little thing that I'd like to talk about, which is the people that came after Darwin and took his ideas and kind of improved on them. So the process, well, the first process during which this happened is what we now call the modern synthesis. And this was basically kind of a period during which people were showing how natural selection and Mendelian genetics worked together. And in fact, that the genetics that Mendel understand were capable of explaining how natural selection would work, and therefore kind of supported Darwin's theory of evolution. And this all kind of occurred during the first half of the 20th century by population geneticists like Fisher and Haldane and Wright. And these guys were able to show that the amount of variation that existed in natural populations was enough to facilitate change through the process of the genetic process that Mendel described. So natural selection basically was acting on very small genetic changes to drive quite gradual evolution. And in some cases actually quite rapid evolution, but this is something that was understood a little bit later in time. Basically what this indicated was that selection was acting on individuals through a process known as microevolution, and could then drive the origin of species in a higher grouping, so the various taxa that we know of, so things like birds and mammals and that sort of thing. And that was a process known as macroevolution. So for example, if you select for tame canines dogs basically, you can create an entire population and subspecies of animal now known as dogs. And all of these guys came from wolves. And there are lots of other changes that accompanied those for tameness, and so we have all of this variation present in the population. And this is actually something I talked a little bit about in a show quite a long time ago when I discussed humans as selection pressures. And this is something that was studied in great detail in foxes, where they were selecting for tame foxes and found all these other changes in their morphology, in their reproductive activities, and a bunch of things like that. And so you could see how these little tiny changes and how friendly the foxes were or not towards humans could then be selected on and create this whole population of tame animals. And in the case of wolves to dogs, it created an entire subspecies. And not only did these guys have that tame quality, they also had all these other qualities that kind of hitchhiked along with the tameness. So the next phase after this was called the modern synthesis. The next phase after the modern synthesis was called the Neo-Darwinian synthesis. And this was driven by other people whose names you'll probably have heard at some point or another. So people like Mayer and Dobzhansky and Simpson and Ford and Huxley. And basically these guys were interested in incorporating speciation with ideas of systematics and development. So how an organism comes to be once the two gametes come together and form a zygote, and how that zygote grows up into an offspring that then becomes juvenile, adolescent, and mature. Morphology, paleontology, all sorts of other fields, how all of these work together and work with genetics and natural selection and evolution, and so tying in all of the different fields of biology and indeed the natural world. So basically these guys were working on expanding and refining and also clarifying the original theory and really kind of putting it into context. And the Neo-Darwinian postulates are similar to those 4 Darwinian postulates that I mentioned earlier, but they're a bit more specific because now a lot of the mechanisms were known, whereas Darwin didn't know a lot of this stuff because it just hadn't been discovered yet, because the equipment just wasn't there. So these guys, they believe that first of all, mutation and recombination generate variation in populations. So now we don't just have variation, we know exactly where they come from, mutation and recombination. They also said that some of this variation was heritable, which of course is what Darwin said, but they were able to add that this is because genes are passed intact from parents to offspring. They also said that in every generation the variation would allow some individuals to survive and reproduce better than others, and that these individuals who survived would pass on genes that were relatively best adapted for the environment. So in other words, kind of the upshot of this is that these guys were pointing out how genes with higher fitness will increase in frequency over time. Now, that kind of gives you all the background of how evolution came into being and how it was kind of, well, not how it came into being, how the theory of evolution came into being, and how the ideas behind this were kind of refined over time. But another thing that's important to understand is that there is a lot of evidence for Darwinian's evolution. And this is not just something that we talk about because there are people who don't believe in God and so they want an alternative to the Bible, but in fact there have been a lot of studies performed, a lot of research conducted, collecting a lot of data that could only really be explained by the theory of evolution. And it's great to look at this stuff because it's really interesting, but also because there are a lot of people out there, as I mentioned earlier, in the US in particular, who want to not believe this and they want to argue with you. And so it's good to have this kind of knowledge so that you can tell them exactly why it is that the theory of evolution makes so much sense. So, as I mentioned earlier, the evolution is only one of the 3 major theories for the evolution of life, the creation of life. So the other 2 are separate creation, which is basically what is talked about in the biblical account. And the major flaw of it is that it offers no explanation of adaptation. The second is transformationism, and this is basically the Marx idea, and it offers no explanation of why some organisms might share traits. And the reason that you hear so much about evolution and not about these others is that there is so much evidence for the former. So this comes from 3 main fields. One is artificial selection, another is selection that happens out in the wild, and the third is experimental evolution, which in many ways is often kind of overlapping with these other 2 traits, other 2 fields, I guess. Artificial selection is selection in which a small minority of the current generation are allowed to breed and then form the next generation. And this is what we do, for example, with cows and pigs and chickens and all these things that we have as domestic stock and also as pets. And this sort of breeding means that the average value in the next generation will differ from the average value of a particular trait from the previous generation. So for example, if you're selecting only the largest bulls to go on and breed, then you're going to have larger bulls in the next generation on average. If you're selecting only the fastest growing pigs, then pigs in your second generation are on average going to grow faster than pigs in your former generation, and so on. And we can see this in all sorts of organisms, from plants to vertebrates to bacteria to viruses, and we can see it in all sorts of traits, whether they're morphological or physiological or even behavioral. And if you assume that these traits are caused by additive genetic variation, or the variation that's associated with having a particular allele or type rather than another, and that this is how this is explained. And additive genetic variation is also known as narrow sense heritability. And this is getting into a little bit of detail, but I'll pop right back out and talk about the macro stuff quickly, I promise. So it's just important to mention this because you might have seen it before when you were in school. So heritability, narrow sense heritability, is signified with a little h squared. And basically it's a really important part of the equation that allows us to estimate the response of organisms to selection, whether it's out in the wild or whether it's in a domestic situation or wherever it happens. So response, or R, is going to be equal to heritability, which is h squared, as I said, multiplied by the selection differential, which is an S. And the selection differential is the average difference between the parent generation and the parents themselves. So it indicates how far above or below the mean of the population the parents are. So basically, if your parents are really intensely large or really intensely fast or whatever the case might be, then you have a better chance of becoming bigger or faster than the other average individuals in the population around you. And there's also something called broad sense heritability, and it's a bit more complex because it reflects all the other stuff that can also contribute to the variation that we see in a population. So things like the dominance interactions that Mendel was looking at, things like maternal and paternal effects. So as your parents raise you, or as your mother incubates you in her womb, she might have some kind of influence on you, for example, and also the effects of epistasis, or the interactions between multiple genes. So there are these two types of heritability that are important to know about because they do allow us to kind of make a lot of predictions about things. And basically people started to first understand this kind of additive genetic variation, or this influence of having a particular allele, by looking at domestic situations. That was Genesis by Grimes. Just before the break, I was talking about some of the evidence for evolution by evolution, and I was talking about artificial selection, but another body of evidence comes from natural selection. And this, of course, is similar to artificial selection in that we expect that the average value of a trait in the next generation will differ from that in the current generation because it will be more or less successful, and so increase or decrease in abundance. And of course, heritability is also still important. And the main difference here, though, is that it's the environment and not the humans who are selecting who is going to survive and breed. And of course, a typical example of this, I already mentioned them earlier, is Darwin's finches. And what happened with Darwin's finches is that it's actually something that we continue to see because there are long-term researchers on the Galapagos watching these guys. And basically they go through these peaks and troughs of environmental conditions, and this helps or hinders the population. And what tends to happen is that when the environment gets really harsh, the number of seeds available will decrease. And this means that there's not enough food available to feed everyone, and so the population decreases. The seeds that are remaining might be, for example, bigger and harder, and so they can't be eaten by all the birds. And so only the birds that are able to eat these things are the ones that will survive. And these might be birds that are larger in general, or that have quite big beaks, or have beaks of a certain depth, or some characteristic that helps them access those resources. those birds are going to be the ones that reproduce and give birth to birds that have a trait like that themselves. And then the entire population, you'll tend to see this trait increasing on average, and so over time this is the thing that becomes more common. But then of course you might have another shift in the environment and you might have the trait go in the opposite direction all over again. So it's going to be a variable thing that's driven by, in this case, the temperature, the amount of water, whatever the weather is like on the islands. This is actually something that was written about in a lot of detail in a book that won the Pulitzer Prize called The Beak of the Finch by Jonathan Weiner. And this is something that I actually read a passage from a couple months ago when I was talking about some of my favorite nature reading. And again, it is a book that I definitely suggest because it's really fascinating to find out a little bit more about evolution in the wild, but also about how people studied it and the amazing just work that these guys are doing on the Galapagos for decades and decades. Now, the final category of evidence for evolution is from experimental selection, and we've done this both accidentally and on purpose, and I have previously discussed this as well. So for example, when I talked on that whole show about how humans can act as a selection pressure, so things that we do like fishing and hunting and using pesticides and all the sorts of anthropogenic disturbances that we kind of inflict on the natural world, all of these are things that have had impacts on an evolutionary scale. So for example, resistance to antibiotics, seeing a change in the average size of fish that we capture when we set out on commercial vessels, animals that breed at different times so that they will be able to escape, and like for example, a fish will breed much earlier so that they can breed before they're captured by fishermen. We also see that animals tend to be warier of us, especially during the hunting season. So all sorts of things that we kind of push through these wild populations of organisms. And for all of these types of selection, not only do we see changes in phenotypes, because that's the quite obvious thing that you can look at and measure very easily, but we can also see changes in genotypes. So we see the allele frequencies changing over time. So in other words, not only do we see anatomical, morphological, behavioral sorts of differences, but we also see that the genetic material of these organisms is changing such that there are some genes or some types of genes that are more popular and more common and others that become less common. And we can also see really important patterns on a larger scale, and these are also really useful to consider when you're trying to think about evolution and providing good evidence for it. So things like vestigial structures. So, for example, whales have these little hind leg bones that are buried deep inside, and of course whales don't need legs, but they evolved from animals that had legs, and so they've still got them. And they're pretty hard to explain away if you don't use the idea of evolution to do so. We also see things like the hybridization of two species to form a completely new species. We see processes like adaptive radiation, where you've got a single species that is an ancestor to lots of new different species that have formed because there was a big range across which the ancestor lived, and conditions were a bit different in different parts of that range, and so eventually, in order to become more perfect for those environments across those ranges, you had all these different species emerging instead of one single species. Of course, also the fossil record is quite important because we see all these examples of extinction events, succession events where you've got one organism kind of gradually changing into another, transition phases so that you have maybe an old species and a new species that we know today, and then these individuals between them that exactly explain how that succession event would have taken place. Things like common ancestry, so the idea of phylogeny, where you can use common features and close resemblances between organisms to allow a hierarchical arrangement of things. And this was something that Darwin actually talked about, and he referred to it as the natural subordination of organic beings in groups under groups. And you'll probably have seen the sorts of diagrams that are made from this concept. You'll see them all over the internet, and I'll post one on the website as well. So some of them, they used to be very tree-like and very vertical, and now we tend to make them very much more like kind of a bush, and it's very branchy, and actually a common thing now is to make them circular, showing that one thing is not higher than another, but in fact we're all kind of equal, we're equally adapted to our environments. Some organisms have just been around a bit longer than others. And another thing, one last thing that's really good evidence, is homology. And this is the idea that there is similarity due to common ancestry. And this similarity can be in structure, or development, or molecules. And a great example of this is in the human arm, and the horse leg, and the bird or bat wing, and the seal flipper, the turtle leg. All of these things look very different if you line them up. But if you take an X-ray, you'll actually see that all of the same kind of bones are there, and they're all kind of roughly in the same shape. They've just changed in size and maybe a little bit in orientation. But you can clearly see how all of these would have come from one ancestor that had one type of arm or leg, whatever you want to call it, and then that kind of was modified in all these different organisms to best suit the environment. So just to kind of reiterate, the whole reason that I wanted to talk about this today was that this is a course that we have at the University of Exeter. I've pulled all of these from the lectures for that course, and I wanted to give you a bit of a taster of some of the stuff that goes on up on our campus. But also, last week, in addition to being Valentine's Day, was also Darwin's birthday, and so it was Darwin Day. And I didn't get a chance to celebrate Darwin's Day because I was talking about love. I thought Valentine's Day would take precedence there. But I did want to give a little nod to him this week, better late than never. And also, there's a great quote from Dobzhansky, who said in 1973 that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So I thought it would be quite appropriate to talk about evolution today in order to kind of give you guys the grounding to maybe better understand some of the stuff that you see out in the wild. And this is certainly something that I always keep in my mind when I'm out looking at birds or picking wildflowers or whatever I might be doing outside, because it does really start to help answer a lot of the questions that you come up with when you see unusual things and wonder how everything works. So on that note, I will end with Emmylou Harris singing The Light, and if there's a bit more time, also Ryan Adams singing Born into a Light.